What do you do when your wife confesses she cheated, miles from home, while a stranger drives? Do you swallow it for the party, or do you stop the car, cancel the ride, and let her learn what alone really costs? My name is Adrian Cross, and I used to believe that loyalty was a private contract you kept even when nobody was watching, the way you keep a promise to yourself on the days you feel weakest. On the night my marriage cracked open, the city looked clean and expensive through the Uber window, all neon reflections and polished glass, as if money could scrub away human nature and leave only the parts people post online. My wife, Lila, sat beside me in the back seat, knees angled toward the door, clutching her little purse like it contained her last moral decision. And I remember thinking she looked too calm for someone who'd been drinking champagne with friends and laughing at a party she hadn't reached yet. The driver had one of those mild, indifferent faces that people develop after years of ferrying strangers and overhearing lies, and his dashboard screen glowed like a small, judgment-free altar to other people's plans. We were on our way to a rooftop birthday party for a friend of hers from work, the kind of event that pretends to be casual while quietly demanding that you dress well and smile like you have nothing to hide. Lila had insisted we go, insisting in that gentle way that feels less like a request and more like a test you do not want to fail. And I had agreed because marriage is full of tiny surrenders that feel harmless until you add them up. She wore a black dress that fit her like a decision, and she had done her makeup with precision, like she was going to be photographed, like she was going to be seen. I wore the only blazer I owned that didn't make me look like a man attending his own trial, and I sat with my hands folded, watching the highway barriers slide by, because the last thing I expected was a confession delivered like a casual weather update. She didn't start with tears or trembling or even a warm-up sentence, and that should have been my warning, because real remorse usually drags its feet. She simply exhaled through her nose, eyes forward, voice quiet enough that it felt designed to sound sincere. She said she had to tell me something before we got there, because she couldn't stand the idea of acting normal at the party while keeping it inside. She said she cheated on me last night, and she said it like she was reading a line she had rehearsed in the mirror, as if the truth becomes less ugly if you deliver it cleanly. Then she added that she just needed to clear her conscience, and in that moment, I realized conscience, for her, was not a compass. It was a trash can. There are people who hear something like that and become a scene, and there are people who hear something like that and go quiet, because their brain turns cold and starts stacking facts like bricks. I felt my heart beat slow, not because I was calm, but because my body had switched from emotion to survival. I looked at her face, and I waited for something to move, for the mask to slip, for fear to appear, and she stared straight ahead as if the road could forgive her if it kept moving. I asked her who it was, and she shook her head once, refusing the details like they were too heavy for her hands. I asked her why she was telling me now, in the car, with a stranger driving, and she said she couldn't keep it in, that she didn't want secrets between us, as if she had not just turned our entire marriage into one. The driver glanced up in the rearview mirror, and I saw his eyes flick between us like he was watching a show he hadn't paid for but didn't mind getting anyway. Lila finally turned to me, and her expression had that polite seriousness people use when they want credit for honesty. She said she was sorry, and she said she loved me, and she said it was a mistake, and each phrase sounded like a coupon she expected me to redeem. Then she touched my arm lightly, the way she touched me when she wanted something, and I felt something in my chest harden into a clean shape. I realized that if I stayed in that car, if I let the night continue, I would become a prop in her story, the forgiving husband at the party, the stable base under her reckless life. I leaned forward and spoke to the driver in a voice that surprised even me with its steadiness. I asked him to stop the car at the next safe spot, and the word safe hung in the air like a joke. The driver hesitated, because stopping on a highway is not what anyone wants, but then he saw my face in the mirror and he understood that this was not a negotiation. He signaled, moved toward the shoulder, and the sound of the tires humming against the asphalt became louder, as if the car itself was listening. Lila's eyes widened, and she asked me what I was doing, not with panic yet, but with confusion, like someone watching their plan drift away. When the car slowed and the hazard lights clicked on, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, and my thumb moved without shaking. I opened the app, I ended the ride, and I watched the screen confirm the cancellation with the same bright cheerfulness it would use to confirm a pizza delivery. I stepped out into cold air that smelled like exhaust and distance, and the noise of traffic rushed past like indifferent applause. Behind me, Lila started talking fast, asking me to get back in, telling me we could talk later, telling me not to do this here. I didn't answer her, because the answer was in my actions, and actions don't need extra words. The driver turned in his seat and spoke to her with the tired authority of someone enforcing a rule he didn't write. He told her the ride was canceled, and he told her she needed to get out. Lila's voice pitched upward, complaining, bargaining, calling it unfair, calling it dangerous, calling it insane, as if she had not just dropped a grenade in our life and expected me to hold it for her. I watched from the shoulder as she climbed out with stiff movements, heels wobbling on gravel, her purse clutched tight, her face now finally showing fear. The driver waited until she closed the door, then he pulled back onto the road without looking at her again, because strangers are allowed to have boundaries. Lila stood there under the harsh strip of roadside light, hair moving in the wind from passing cars, and she stared at me like I had become someone else. The party was still ahead somewhere, music and laughter waiting for us, and the absurdity of it made my mouth tighten. I didn't yell at her, I didn't call her names, I didn't give her anything dramatic to use later as proof that I was the villain. I simply looked at her the way you look at a person after you realize you never truly knew them. Then I walked a few steps away because I didn't trust myself to stand close. She followed, shoes scraping, and she said my name like it was a rope she could throw around my waist. She asked how she was supposed to get home, and she said it with the same entitlement she had used in the car, as if my job was still to clean up her mess. I told her she should call the person she chose over me last night, because she seemed to like using other people for comfort. She flinched at that, and for a second I saw anger in her eyes, not shame, and that was the moment my last sympathy dried up. She told me I was being cruel, and I almost laughed, because cruelty is a word people use when consequences finally arrive. I kept my voice quiet, because rage is loud and I didn't want to give her loud. I told her I needed space, and I told her she was free to get it wherever she had been getting everything else lately. She started crying then, but the tears came late, like an afterthought, and I didn't know whether they were for me or for herself. I watched a car pass, then another, and I thought about how simple it is for a life to split into before and after with one sentence. I thought about all the small signs I had ignored, all the late errands, the long showers, the sudden new perfume, the way she had guarded her phone like it was a living creature. She reached for my hand and I pulled back, because touch is not an apology. It is a request. She asked me to talk, and I told her we had already talked, back in the car, when she had used honesty like a cleansing ritual. She said it was one night, one mistake, and I asked her why she picked the night before a party where I would be introduced to all the people she spent her days with, the people who would smile at me like they weren't standing near the edge of my humiliation. She stared at me, and for a moment she looked like she might tell the truth. But the moment passed. She said she didn't know. She was drunk. She was stressed. She just needed to feel wanted. And each excuse landed like a cheap coin tossed at a broken window. 10 minutes after the Uber left, her phone lit up, and she showed me the screen like it was evidence that she was suffering. The message asked how she was supposed to get home, and the phrasing made my stomach twist, because it proved her first thought was still logistics, still rescue, still me. I didn't take her phone. I didn't demand to see anything. because tonight was not about uncovering details, it was about drawing a line. I told her to call a rideshare, and she said her app wasn't working because her battery was low. I offered no charger, because I wasn't her emergency kit anymore. She stared at me with fresh disbelief, as if she thought marriage meant endless grace no matter what she did. We stood there, two silhouettes beside a river of cars, and I felt a strange clarity settle over me. I wasn't thinking about vengeance yet, and I wasn't thinking about reconciliation. I was thinking about control, about how she had chosen a moment when I couldn't easily leave without a scene, when she could frame my reaction, when she could contain the fallout until after the party. She had given me the confession as a small, controlled burn, hoping to prevent a wildfire. Instead, she had handed me the match and expected me to put it out with my own hands. Eventually, a rideshare did come, one she called from a browser, and the car's headlights washed over her face, turning her tears into glittering streaks. She asked if I was coming, and I told her no, because the last place I wanted to be was a party full of people who would pretend not to watch. She told me she would go home, and she asked if I would be there when she arrived. I didn't answer, because some answers are better delivered by silence. The driver honked once, impatient, and she got in, looking back at me through the rear window like a person leaving a ship she had already sunk. I started walking along the shoulder toward the nearest exit, because standing still felt like agreeing to be part of her story. My phone buzzed again, message after message, each one shifting tone like a bad actor trying different emotions. She apologized again. She asked me to talk. She accused me of endangering her. She promised she would make it right. She said she loved me. I didn't reply, because replying would turn it into a conversation, and I didn't want a conversation. I wanted facts, and I wanted time, and I wanted the space to decide what kind of man I would be next. By the time I reached an overpass and found a well-lit gas station, my hands were steady, but my insides felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the part of me that assumed safety. I ordered a coffee I didn't want, and I sat on a plastic chair by the window, watching cars pull in and leave, watching people live their simple lives while mine rearranged itself. I opened my messages and I read them again, not to hurt myself, but to observe the pattern. Lila wasn't asking how I felt, not really. She was asking what I would do, which meant her fear was not my pain, but my response. When I finally called a ride for myself, I used my own app, my own account, my own quiet little signal to the universe that I was no longer sharing everything with her by default. The driver who picked me up didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer any, because strangers do not need to know your heartbreak to get you home. The streets blurred by, and I watched the city's lights smear into long lines, like the world was moving too fast for my life to keep up. I thought about the party we never reached, and I felt a wave of relief, because somewhere out there were people who had no idea the story had changed, and I was grateful not to give them a front row seat. When I got home, the house felt too quiet, and my key turned in the lock with a soft click that sounded final. I walked through rooms full of shared furniture and shared choices, and I realized the house had been a stage for a marriage I had believed in more than she did. I set my phone on the kitchen counter and I stared at it, waiting for it to buzz again like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. I didn't pour a drink because I didn't want to blur anything tonight. I wanted every detail sharp, because sharp details are how you build the truth, and the truth is how you survive. I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the clean sheets, wondering if the betrayal had happened in a hotel room, a car, someone else's apartment, somewhere with different pillows and a different smell. I pictured her laughing with a man whose name I didn't know, and I felt a heat rise in my chest that threatened to turn into something loud. I breathed through it, because loud anger is a gift to someone who wants to paint you as unstable. I wasn't going to give her that. If my marriage was going to end, it would end with me standing upright, not stumbling. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with another message, and this one was shorter, stripped of drama like she had finally realized she was losing. She asked if we could talk in the morning, and she said she would explain everything. I stared at the screen for a long time, and I realized that explanations are often just stories told to protect the teller. I didn't want her story yet. I wanted the truth, and I wanted to decide what I would do with it. I turned off the lights and lay down, and I didn't sleep, not really. I drifted in and out, hearing the phantom hum of the highway, seeing her face under that roadside light, watching the moment she realized I was not going to carry her anymore. In the early hours, my mind began doing what minds do when they are wounded and cornered. It began planning, not revenge with blood, but revenge with clarity, revenge with consequences that fit the crime, revenge that would make her understand that a confession does not erase a betrayal, it only documents it. By morning, the sun found its way through the blinds, and the room looked ordinary, which felt like an insult. I got up, showered, dressed, and moved around the house with the calm of a man who had already crossed an internal line. I made coffee, not because I wanted it, but because routine is a rope you can hold onto when everything else falls away. Then I sat at the kitchen table with my phone, and I opened a note, and I typed the first sentence of a new ledger. Date, time, place, event. Confession delivered in an Uber. Ride canceled. Wife left on the roadside. Text received 10 minutes later asking how to get home. I typed it all with clinical precision because memory can be twisted, but a written timeline holds still. I didn't know yet who the man was, and I didn't know yet how deep it went, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Lila had chosen the night before a public event to confess because she believed she could control the fallout. She believed she could trap me between embarrassment and forgiveness, between keeping the peace and keeping my dignity. She had gambled that I would be too polite to do anything drastic. She had misjudged me, and in a strange way, that misjudgment was my first advantage. When Lila finally came home, it was late morning, and I heard the front door open softly, like she was trying to sneak past the wreckage. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, coffee gone cold, note still open on my phone, because I wanted her to see me calm. She walked in with yesterday's makeup smudged, hair slightly tangled, and she looked smaller in the daylight, less like a woman with control, and more like a woman who had just discovered gravity. She started crying again the moment she saw me, but I didn't move toward her, because comfort is for people who haven't set fires. She said my name, and she started apologizing, and she promised she would tell me everything. I let her talk, because people reveal themselves when they think they still have a chance. She said it was a coworker, then she said it wasn't exactly a coworker, then she said it was complicated, and I watched the way her story shifted. I asked simple questions, and each time I asked, she hesitated, which told me more than her words. I asked where it happened. I asked if it was planned. I asked if it had happened before. She said no at first. Then she said not really. Then she said she didn't know why she did it. And I realized she was still trying to choose a version that would hurt her least. I told her I didn't want a story right now, and I told her I wanted facts. I told her to sit down, and she sat, hands trembling, eyes searching my face for mercy. I looked at her, and I said something simple, something almost polite, because sarcasm is sharper when it is quiet. I told her that last night she had cleared her conscience, and now it was my turn to clear my life. She stared at me, and the fear in her eyes deepened because she finally understood that confession was not a reset button, it was a timestamp. Then I asked her for one thing, a single detail she could not dodge, a detail that would either be true or false. I asked for the man's first name, and I told her this was the moment to stop managing and start telling. She swallowed hard, and she said a name, and I repeated it back slowly, as if tasting it, as if deciding how it would look written down in my evidence ledger. She asked what I was doing, and I told her I was documenting reality, because reality is what survives when trust dies. She tried to reach across the table, and I leaned back. keeping distance like it was a rule. She asked if we could fix it, and I told her that fixing is what you do after a spill, not after a betrayal. She asked if I hated her, and I told her hate would mean she still mattered in the same way, and that was not where I was headed. She started pleading, promising therapy, promising transparency, promising anything she thought might slow the falling. I listened without reacting, because I was already thinking about the next 30 days, and how quickly a life can be rebuilt when you stop lying to yourself about who you married. I told her to give me space, and I told her to sleep in the guest room for now, and I told her the party was canceled forever. She tried to protest, and I cut her off with a calm look, because calm is a weapon when someone expects chaos. She moved upstairs slowly, and I heard the guest room door close. I sat alone at the table, stared at my phone, and I added another line to my ledger. Morning after. Partial admission, name provided, story inconsistent, emotional manipulation attempted, physical touch attempted. I typed it all, because one day, when she tried to reshape this into something softer, I wanted the sharp edges ready. By noon, messages started arriving from friends about the party, about why we didn't show, about whether everything was okay. I didn't answer immediately because answers create narratives, and I wasn't ready to hand anyone a narrative yet. I watched the notifications pile up, and I realized the social part of betrayal is always the hidden cost. Cheating is not just sex, it is reputation, it is alliances, it is the way people look at you when they think you will accept anything. I wasn't going to accept anything. I opened my contacts, hovered over a few names, and then I stopped, because rushing would make mistakes. I needed a plan that didn't rely on shouting or exposing private details for cheap sympathy. I needed something clean, something lawful, something that would hold if challenged. I thought about what Lila had done last night, how she had confessed while trying to keep control, and I realized that control is the thing she values most. So the consequence had to target that, not her body, not her safety, but her image, her access, her ability to walk into rooms and be treated like a good person without earning it. I stood, rinsed my coffee cup, and placed it in the sink with careful movements, because careful movements keep your mind from spiraling. Then I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a folder we used for household paperwork, the boring stuff that nobody thinks about until it becomes important. Inside were receipts, contracts, insurance papers, and a little stack of printouts from our last vacation. I set the folder on the table and I flipped it open, because that was the kind of evidence I could gather without becoming someone I didn't respect. No hacking, no spying, no tricks. Just the paper trail of a life she had abused. I didn't know yet how this would end, but I knew the beginning had already been written for me. My wife confessed in an Uber because she wanted to feel clean. I stopped the car because I wanted her to feel the weight of what she did. Now the only question left was how far she had gone, and how far I was willing to go to make sure she couldn't rewrite the truth when it suited her. The folder on the table looked harmless, like every other folder that ever held boring paperwork. But the moment you open something like that after a betrayal, it stops being paper and starts being a map. I didn't rummage through it like a jealous teenager, because jealousy is emotional, and emotion is messy, and messy gives the liar room to dance. Instead, I sorted like a man who had just learned his house had termites, and now he needed to know where the rot began and how far it spread without bringing the whole structure down on himself. Lila stayed upstairs for most of the afternoon, moving quietly, as if careful footsteps could undo last night, and every time I heard a floorboard creak, I felt the same cold irritation because she was treating the house like a place she could still share with me while pretending it hadn't become a crime scene. I kept my phone face down, but I could feel it vibrating with messages from people who thought our absence was just a scheduling hiccup, and I resented their ignorance more than their curiosity, because ignorance is a luxury I didn't have anymore. I opened the folder, slid out the most recent bank statements, and scanned them not for dramatic charges that screamed affair, but for changes in rhythm, because the truth rarely announces itself. It leaks. There were the normal things first: groceries, utilities, a few small online purchases, and then a cluster of late-night ride charges that stood out because they were small enough to be overlooked and frequent enough to be intentional. They were billed to my account because we had shared payment for convenience, and convenience is a sweet little trap that only snaps shut when someone decides you're too naive to check. I wrote down dates and times, and I compared them with what I could remember of her cover stories. Because memory is weak, but patterns are stubborn. One charge matched a night she said she stayed late for team planning, and another matched the weekend she claimed she was helping a friend move. And a third landed on the Thursday she kissed my cheek before leaving and told me not to wait up because she had a client dinner, which made me almost smile because she had used the same tone for all of it, warm and responsible, like a woman doing the right thing. I didn't need to know where she went yet, because the where was less important than the fact that she used my account to travel to it, like she couldn't even bother to keep her betrayal self-funded. That detail wasn't about money, it was about disrespect, and disrespect is what predicts the next lie. I took a photo of the statement page with my phone and then set it aside because I was building an evidence ledger, not a revenge scrapbook, and I wanted every item to be defensible if challenged. Then I opened our shared calendar on the kitchen tablet, the one we used for birthdays and dentist visits, and the occasional pretend date night, and I scrolled back through the last month, because calendars are where people hide sins behind innocent words. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but ordinary is where the clever ones hide, because ordinary is what no one questions. She had blocks labeled volunteer committee, fitness consult, errands, quick coffee, and work check-in, and each label was vague enough to mean anything and neat enough to sound real. I exported a weak view as a PDF and saved it, not because a PDF is dramatic, but because a record that doesn't change is worth more than a conversation that can be rewritten. Then I compared the ride charges to the calendar blocks, and the overlap was so clean it almost felt insulting, because it meant she thought she had built a perfect little system, and systems always fail when one variable turns honest. Around 4, my phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't a friend asking about the party. It was a message from a number I recognized as her coworker's wife, Mara Keene, because Lila had talked about her in passing, the way people talk about someone else's furniture, as if it's just part of the environment. Mara had invited us to dinner once, months ago, and Lila had declined, claiming she was exhausted, and I remembered thinking it was strange that she didn't even try. Now that memory rearranged itself into something uglier, because exhaustion is often just avoidance wearing pajamas. Mara's message was short, polite, and sharpened at the edges, asking if everything was okay, because Lila hadn't shown up for the party and hadn't responded to work texts, and people were starting to speculate. I stared at the screen and considered the possible outcomes of replying, because any response would become part of a chain, and chains are what you use to pull the truth into daylight. I didn't answer her immediately, because timing matters, and I wanted my next move to be calm, not reactive. Instead, I went upstairs and knocked on the guest room door, not like a husband asking for reconciliation, but like a landlord checking on a tenant who had missed rent. Lila opened the door a crack, eyes red, hair tied back, face washed clean of makeup, as if she thought a bare face looked more sincere. She started talking before I said anything, telling me she hadn't slept, telling me she hated herself, telling me she knew she ruined everything. And it was almost impressive how quickly she tried to flood the room with emotion, because floods are meant to wash away footprints. I held up my hand, and she stopped, and I asked her for one thing again, because one thing is all you need to test whether a person is ready to be honest. I asked for the man's full name, and I watched her blink like I had asked for a confession in a courtroom. She said she didn't want to drag anyone else into it, and I told her she already had, because she dragged me, and the Uber driver, and now every person at that party into it the moment she decided her conscience needed a rinse. She hesitated, then said in a low voice that his name was Ethan Rook, and I felt my mouth tighten. Not because the name mattered, but because she said it like she was giving up a piece of property she thought she still owned. I repeated it back, and I asked where he worked, and she admitted he worked with her, and she admitted his wife was Mara. And the air in the hallway changed, because now the betrayal had a shape and a neighborhood. She started pleading again, saying it was only one night, saying it wasn't emotional, saying it didn't mean anything, and I nearly laughed, because the line people use when they want forgiveness is always that it didn't mean anything, as if meaning is the only part that hurts. I told her to stop trying to minimize it because minimizing is just lying with softer words. Then I asked her one more question, a question designed to be simple and deadly, and I asked whether Ethan's wife knew. Lila looked down, and that answer came without words because shame has its own grammar, and I felt something inside me settle into a decision. I went back downstairs and sat at the table again, and I opened Mara's message, and I typed a reply that was factual and careful, because I didn't want a war of rumors. I wanted a chain of verified truths. I told her I was sorry she was being pulled into something ugly, and I told her Lila had admitted to cheating last night, and I told her I now believed Ethan was involved, and I told her I had documentation that supported the timeline. I didn't add emotion, and I didn't add insults, because insults give people permission to dismiss you as unstable, and I wasn't going to be dismissed. I hit send, and the act felt less like revenge and more like returning a stolen item to its owner, because the truth had been taken from her too. 10 minutes later, Mara called, and I let it ring twice before I answered, because I wanted her to hear my steadiness. Her voice was tight and controlled, the voice of a woman standing in a kitchen while her world tips, and she asked me what I meant, and she asked if I was sure, and she asked how I knew. I told her what Lila admitted in the car, and I told her I had ride charges and calendar overlaps, and I told her I wasn't speculating. I was documenting. Mara went quiet for a long moment, and in that silence I heard the sound of someone replaying their last few months with fresh eyes, and I knew that this phone call would become a fork in the road. Mara didn't scream, and she didn't cry on the call, which told me she was the kind of person who turns grief into focus. She asked if I would forward her the dates, and I said I would, because this wasn't a secret I owed my wife. It was a wound I owed the other spouse the chance to treat. I texted her screenshots of the statement lines and the calendar export, and I kept the message short, because the documents were doing the talking now. Then I sat back and waited. Not because I enjoyed waiting, but because once you move the first piece, the other pieces start moving on their own, and you learn who your enemies really are. By evening, the first wave hit. Lila came downstairs with her phone in her hand, and her face turned white with panic, because she had received a message from Ethan demanding to know what she had told me, and she had received another from her manager asking why she hadn't shown up, and the neat little compartment she built between home and work was suddenly on fire. She asked me what I did, and I told her I corrected an information imbalance, which is a polite way of saying I refused to be the only person bleeding. She started shouting, accusing me of ruining her life, and I watched the irony land in the room like a bad smell, because she had ruined it the moment she climbed into someone else's bed and then used my conscience as a laundry service. I didn't shout back, because shouting is what she wanted. Shouting is what she could record. Shouting is what she could later describe as abuse when she needed allies. Instead, I told her to sit down, and I told her we were going to be adults about logistics now, because romance had died on the highway shoulder and logistics were all that remained. I told her she would not be attending any work events with me again, and I told her she would not be using my account for rides anymore, and I told her she could either cooperate with a clean separation or I could make it a public record, because I had no interest in private suffering that benefited only the liar. That word, record, made her flinch, and the flinch was almost satisfying, because it meant she finally understood the difference between a confession and a consequence. She tried to bargain, offering to call Mara herself, offering to resign, offering to do counseling, offering to hand me her phone. I told her I didn't want her phone, because a phone is just a device, and she was the one who decided to betray, and devices don't make choices. I told her she would send Mara a message acknowledging the truth and apologizing, because anything less would leave Mara drowning in uncertainty. Lila refused at first, saying it would destroy Ethan, and the moment she said Ethan's name with concern, I knew the betrayal wasn't just physical, because concern is attachment, and attachment is time. I looked at her and asked her, calmly, if she wanted to protect the man who helped her cheat, or the marriage she claimed she wanted to fix, and she stared at me like she couldn't believe I would force her to choose. I waited, because silence is pressure, and pressure reveals priorities. Finally, she typed a message with shaking hands, and she showed it to me as if seeking approval, and I nodded once because it was good enough to be undeniable. She hit send, and then she started crying again, and I watched her cry with a detachment that frightened even me, because once trust breaks, empathy becomes expensive. Later that night, I got a final message from Mara. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't polite anymore. It was raw and direct. She thanked me for not letting her live in ignorance, and she told me Ethan had tried to deny it, and she told me he changed his story twice in 10 minutes, and she told me she was going to speak to a lawyer. I read it, and I felt a grim sense of alignment because the truth was moving toward the people who deserved it. Then I shut my phone off because I needed sleep, and I knew sleep would be hard, because the mind keeps replaying betrayal like it's searching for a frame where you could have stopped it. In the dark, I lay on my side and listened to the house, and I realized the most painful part wasn't even the cheating. It was the way she tried to manage me, the way she delivered the confession like a performance, the way she expected me to keep her safe while she dismantled my life. I made a decision there, in the quiet, a decision that felt like putting a lock on a door. I would not chase her for answers. I would not beg for closure. I would document, I would act, and I would let the consequences do the talking, because words were her favorite weapon, and I was done fighting her on her preferred battlefield. The next morning started with a kind of eerie normal, because the world doesn't stop for betrayal, and that fact is both comforting and insulting. I woke up early, made coffee again, and watched the sunrise smear pale light across the kitchen tiles, as if the universe had no idea a marriage had imploded on a freeway shoulder. Lila came downstairs later, moving cautiously like an injured animal, and she hovered near the counter as if she wanted to ask permission to exist. She didn't speak at first, and neither did I, because the silence between us had become its own language, and every sentence risked turning into a fight she could later use as ammunition. My phone turned back on, and the messages that arrived were not from friends anymore, because the party had already done its job as a rumor incubator. The messages were from people orbiting Lila's workplace, people who knew how to ask questions without sounding like they were asking questions. One friend said they hoped everything was okay, another said they heard something weird happened last night with an Uber, and a third asked if Lila was sick because she missed an important morning meeting. I read them and felt that cold irritation return because I knew what was happening behind the scenes. Lila was losing control of the narrative, and she was trying to decide which version of the story would save her most face. She finally spoke, voice hoarse, and she asked if I planned to ruin her at work. The phrasing was perfect, because it framed her reputation as something I might damage, not something she might have damaged herself. I told her I planned to tell the truth where it needed to be told, and I planned to stop lying by omission, because omission is just cowardice wearing manners. She said Ethan was furious, and Mara was going crazy, and she said it like Mara was the problem, like the betrayed spouse was an inconvenience. I looked at Lila and asked her if she heard herself, and she didn't answer because answering would require self-awareness, and self-awareness is uncomfortable. I told her we were going to handle immediate logistics first because when a house is burning, you don't debate aesthetics. I told her we would separate finances today, at least the discretionary spending, and I told her she would no longer have access to my account for rides or subscriptions. She protested, saying it was petty, and I corrected her, saying it was sane. I didn't cut her off from necessities because I wasn't trying to punish her into homelessness. I was trying to stop funding my own humiliation. I opened my banking app, changed passwords, removed shared cards, and created a new account for household bills that would be monitored and predictable, because predictability is what you cling to when a person you trusted becomes unpredictable. Lila watched me do it, eyes narrowed, and she asked if I was enjoying this. I told her no, because enjoyment would mean this was play and this was surgery. I told her I didn't want revenge that felt good. I wanted consequences that fit, consequences that lasted, consequences that made it impossible for her to pretend this was just an unfortunate night that we overcame with love. She stared at me, and I could see she wanted the old me, the version who would soften, the version who would compromise. That version of me had stepped out of an Uber and never got back in. Around mid-morning, Mara called again, and this time her voice sounded different, steadier, like she had already crossed a line inside herself. She told me she had spoken to an attorney, and she was gathering her own documentation, because Ethan was now claiming Lila initiated everything, and he was trying to paint himself as a victim of temptation. Mara asked me if Lila would be willing to sign a written statement confirming what she told me, and I almost smiled at the simplicity of it, because written statements are where liars start sweating. I told Mara I would ask, but I didn't promise, because Lila had already proven she preferred comfort over integrity. When I brought it up to Lila, she reacted exactly as expected. She said she couldn't put anything in writing because it might hurt her career, and the speed of her concern for her career would have been funny if it wasn't my life she was standing in. I told her she had already hurt her career by mixing it with her appetite, and I told her refusing to write the truth wouldn't protect her. It would just make her look like a coward to everyone already watching. She said she didn't trust Mara, and I told her that was rich coming from the woman who betrayed both of us. Then I offered her a choice, because choices are fair, and fairness matters if you plan to win clean. I told her she could write a simple statement acknowledging the affair happened and confirming the timeline she admitted to me, or she could refuse and let Ethan spin whatever story he wanted, and I would not correct it for her. Lila stared at the table, jaw clenched, and I watched her weigh loyalty to her lover against the shrinking possibility of salvaging anything with me. That silence lasted long enough to become revealing, and finally, she said she would not put anything in writing. I nodded once and said fine, because fine is what you say when you've just learned your enemy's next move. I texted Mara and told her Lila refused, and I told her I wasn't surprised. Mara responded with one sentence that felt like a door closing, saying she understood, and saying she had enough already. I believed her, because Ethan had likely left a trail of his own, and men like that always do, because they think charm is an invisibility cloak. I set my phone down and felt the shift in the air, because now the fallout would spread beyond my control, and that was both dangerous and useful. Dangerous because rumors can mutate. Useful because the truth, once released, rarely returns to its cage. By afternoon, Lila's manager called her, and I heard the conversation from the kitchen, because she wasn't careful anymore. She was panicking. She kept saying she was dealing with a personal emergency, and she kept promising she would be back tomorrow, and she kept trying to sound professional while her voice cracked. Then she lowered her voice, and I heard the words HR and complaint and policy, and my mind clicked into that cold pattern again, because workplaces don't care about your feelings, they care about liability. If Ethan and Lila had been reckless, if they used company time or a work event as cover, then the affair wasn't just betrayal, it was misconduct, and misconduct has paperwork, and paperwork has teeth. When she hung up, she turned to me and demanded to know what I told Mara, as if Mara was the only leak. I told Lila I told the truth, and I told her the truth was going to travel faster now than she could outrun it. She started crying again, but this time the tears were sharpened with anger, and she accused me of trying to destroy her. I looked at her and said something that was simple, not cruel, just accurate. I told her she was experiencing the natural result of acting like consequences were optional. That evening, she tried a different tactic, because manipulators always do. She cooked dinner, something elaborate, something she knew I used to like, and she set the table like we were pretending to be normal again. She spoke gently, asked about my day, said she wanted to work on us, said she would do therapy, said she would cut Ethan off completely. I listened and ate in silence, because food is not a time machine. Then she asked me what she could do to fix it, and there it was, the question designed to place the responsibility back in my hands. The question that implied repair was a shared project, not the consequence of her betrayal. I put my fork down and looked at her, and I told her the fix was not a single action, it was a pattern, and she had already shown me her pattern. I reminded her she confessed only to clear her conscience, not to protect me. I reminded her she refused to write a statement because she wanted to protect her career and her lover. I reminded her she used my account to fund rides to wherever she was going. I told her those weren't isolated mistakes. They were choices, and choices build character. She sat very still, and in that stillness I could see she finally understood that I wasn't going to be wooed back into denial. She asked if I was going to divorce her, and the question came out small, like a child asking if a punishment is real. I told her I was meeting with an attorney to understand my options, because understanding is what you do before you act. She asked if I would tell everyone what she did, and I told her I would tell people who needed the truth, and I would not lie to protect her image anymore. She accused me of being cold, and I agreed, because cold is what keeps you from bleeding out. Then she said something that revealed more than she intended, because desperation loosens tongues. She said I always wanted control, and maybe that's why she did it, because she wanted to feel like she had something that was hers. I stared at her and almost smiled, because in her mind, betrayal was a rebellion, a way to reclaim power, a way to punish me for being stable. I told her she could have reclaimed power by leaving honestly, by speaking plainly, by choosing integrity. Instead, she chose secrecy and then demanded applause for confession. I told her if she wanted something that was hers, she now had it, because she owned this outcome. That sentence ended the conversation, because she had no useful reply, and she knew it. Later, after she went upstairs, I sat in the living room with the folder and my phone and my evidence ledger, and I started organizing what I had, because organization turns pain into leverage. I stapled statement pages in chronological order. I labeled screenshots with dates. I wrote down the exact time of her confession in the Uber, because details matter when someone tries to revise history. I wasn't doing it to obsess, and I wasn't doing it to punish her with paperwork. I was doing it because when people like Lila feel cornered, they don't suddenly become honest. They become creative. Near midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and I opened it to find Ethan's name in the first line, written with the confidence of a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. He claimed he wanted to clear the air, and he claimed Lila was unstable, and he claimed he didn't want drama. I read it twice and felt a calm amusement, because men like that always want no drama after they create chaos, as if the world is rude for reacting. I didn't reply, because replying would pull me into his orbit, and I had no intention of letting him turn this into a negotiation. Instead, I took a screenshot of his message, saved it in the ledger, and wrote a note beside it that was almost clinical. Lover-initiated contact, attempted narrative control, preemptive blame shift. Then I turned my phone off again and sat in the dark, because I could feel the next phase forming. Lila had confessed to ease herself. Ethan had contacted me to manage risk. Mara had started building her own case. HR had entered the orbit. The story was no longer private, and the only real question now was how quickly Lila would abandon truth in favor of survival, because survival without integrity is just a more polished kind of lying. I went to bed with that thought sitting heavy in my chest, not fear, not rage, but the sober understanding that the next days would decide who controlled the record. Lila wanted a soft story about one mistake and a guilty confession. Ethan wanted a story where he was tempted and misunderstood. Mara wanted the truth because she deserved it. And I wanted something simpler than any of their stories, something that could not be twisted. I wanted a clean line in public space where everyone could see it, and where nobody could claim later they didn't know, because the only justice people like Lila understand is the kind that leaves witnesses. The second day after the freeway confession was when I stopped feeling shocked and started feeling insulted, because shock is the body's reaction to an unexpected event, and insult is what comes after you realize someone expected you to swallow it. Lila moved through the house like she was waiting for a verdict, hovering near doorways, pausing as if she might apologize again, and then pulling back when she sensed I wasn't going to reward her with comfort. She kept trying to make eye contact, as if eye contact could substitute for accountability, and every time she looked at me, I saw the same thing underneath the tears and the soft voice, which was calculation, because she wasn't asking how to make me whole, she was asking how to make this end without costing her what she wanted to keep. I spent that morning turning the mess into a ledger, because a ledger is not emotional, and it doesn't care about excuses. I opened the rideshare app on my phone and found the trip history, not to play detective, but to extract the only parts that mattered: dates, times, pickup points, and the cancellation record from the night she confessed. The app showed the cancellation timestamp, and it showed the fee, and it showed the driver's rating prompt I ignored, because I had been too busy standing on the shoulder of a highway watching my marriage crawl away on someone else's conscience. I took screenshots that captured the metadata and saved them with the bank statement lines, because when a liar tries to reframe the story, the easiest way to cut through it is to show that your timeline does not bend. Then I searched my email for the rideshare receipts, because those little automated messages have a nasty habit of being more reliable than human memory. I found the receipt from the confession night, the one that confirmed the pickup and the route, and I found the cancellation notice that landed right after I got out, and I saved the headers as well, because headers are boring until someone tries to accuse you of forging something. I didn't need a dramatic smoking gun. I needed a sequence that a stranger could understand in 30 seconds, because the truth that requires a speech is a truth that can be debated, and I wasn't building something debatable. Lila came downstairs while I was doing it and asked why I was still going through all that, as if 2 days had been enough time to move on from betrayal, and I told her I wasn't going through it, I was documenting it. She said I was treating her like an enemy, and I told her she had already made herself one by choosing secrecy and then demanding mercy. She tried to pivot into a softer tone, asking if we could sit and talk like adults, and I almost laughed, because she kept using the word adult as if it meant I should absorb her choices politely. I told her we could talk after I spoke to a lawyer, because adults don't improvise legal and financial consequences, they plan them. That word, lawyer, triggered another round of pleading. She said lawyers would make it ugly. She said she didn't want anyone to know. She said she was afraid of what would happen if her work found out. I listened, and then I asked her a question that was not about her feelings, but about her priorities. I asked her whether she regretted cheating or whether she regretted confessing, and the pause that followed was the loudest thing in the room, because she knew the honest answer would make her look worse, and the dishonest answer would not convince me. Finally, she said she regretted everything, and I nodded like I accepted it, because I didn't need her regret. I needed her reality. After she went back upstairs, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from my friend Calvin asking if I was alive, because people love drama until it becomes inconvenient, and then they pretend they are checking on your well-being. I replied with something neutral, because I wasn't ready to feed the rumor mill, and I asked him calmly what he had heard. He hesitated, then admitted that at the party people were already joking about Lila getting kicked out of an Uber and stranded, and they were acting like it was a funny story, because strangers always find humor in someone else's humiliation. I felt my jaw tighten, not because of the jokes, but because I realized the story was being told without the truth, and that meant someone was shaping it. I didn't have to guess who. Lila had always been good at controlling perception, the kind of woman who could smile through a lie and make people feel rude for doubting her. If she was letting people laugh about the Uber incident, then she had likely framed it as me overreacting, me being dramatic, me being cold and punishing, and she had likely omitted the part where she confessed to cheating in that same moving car. That kind of omission is not a detail, it is a weapon, because it turns the betrayed spouse into the villain and the betrayer into the victim. I thanked Calvin for telling me. Then I asked him one more thing, quietly, and I asked him whether Ethan had been at the party. Calvin said Ethan was there for a while and left early, and he said Mara looked like she had been crying in the bathroom, and he said nobody knew why. I stared at the message and felt the pieces align, because Ethan leaving early wasn't random, it was damage control. He had likely seen the rumor starting, and he had likely decided to disappear before someone asked him direct questions. I typed back and told Calvin I would talk later, then I put my phone down and sat at the table, because I could feel the situation turning from personal betrayal into social chess, and I needed to move before someone else decided the narrative for me. That afternoon, I met with an attorney, not in a dramatic office with leather chairs and heavy books, but in a small room with a clean desk and fluorescent lighting that made everything look like paperwork. Her name was Dana Holt, and she didn't waste time with sympathy, which I appreciated, because sympathy is a nice perfume and it does not solve anything. She asked me to start from the beginning, and I told her the canon truth in a calm voice, because calm is a form of control. I told her about the Uber ride to the party. I told her Lila confessed she cheated the night before to clear her conscience. I told her I got out, canceled the ride on my app, and watched the driver force her out on the side of the freeway. I told her about the text 10 minutes later asking how she was supposed to get home, a text that sounded less like fear and more like entitlement. Dana didn't flinch, and she didn't judge me for the freeway part, which surprised me, because most people react to that moment like it's the headline, not the context. She asked if there was any physical confrontation, and I said no, because I wasn't going to lie to look better, and I wasn't going to embellish to look tougher. She asked if there were children involved, and I said no, because in the canon of my life right now, thank God, there was at least that. She asked about finances, shared accounts, property, and whether there was any history of threats or volatility. I told her the truth again. Shared accounts, no children, leased home, no physical violence, plenty of emotional manipulation, and now a clear pattern of deception. Then she asked me what I wanted, and I paused, because the question sounds simple, but it isn't. I told her I wanted separation terms that protected me financially and socially, and I wanted to prevent Lila from rewriting the story in a way that painted me as unstable or abusive. Dana nodded and told me something that made me almost smile, because it was exactly the kind of unromantic truth I needed. She said that when a marriage ends, the person who controls the record controls the aftermath. She told me to document everything. She told me to communicate in writing. She told me to avoid private confrontations that could be twisted. She told me to keep my actions proportionate and lawful. In other words, she told me to do what I was already doing, which meant I was not losing my mind. I was adapting. When I left her office, I didn't feel relief, but I felt clarity, and clarity is the next best thing. I went to a cafe, opened my laptop, and drafted a simple separation proposal. Nothing dramatic, nothing vindictive, just clean lines, separate finances, separate living arrangements, mutual non-disparagement, and a timeline for next steps. I didn't frame it as a punishment, because punishment invites argument, and I wasn't interested in debates about fairness. I framed it as a consequence of broken trust, because broken trust is not a problem you fix with promises, it is a condition you manage with boundaries. By the time I got home, Lila was waiting in the living room, sitting upright like she had rehearsed being calm. She asked where I went, and I told her I met with counsel. She asked if I planned to take everything, and I told her I planned to take my life back, which was the only honest answer. Then she said something that confirmed what I already suspected, because liars cannot resist testing whether you will still protect them. She said, people were saying I abandoned her on the freeway, and she said she had told them it was a misunderstanding, and she said she didn't want anyone to think badly of me. I looked at her for a long moment, because the absurdity was almost beautiful in a grotesque way. She had cheated, confessed in an Uber, and now she was positioning herself as my protector. I asked her quietly whether she told them why she was kicked out. She said she didn't think it was necessary to share that because it was personal. I nodded slowly and felt the anger sharpen into something cleaner, because now I wasn't just dealing with betrayal, I was dealing with narrative theft. She was trying to keep the confession private so she could keep the blame public. I told her the truth was going to be shared with the people who were already discussing the story, because if a story exists publicly, then the truth that explains it cannot be kept private without turning you into a villain. She panicked immediately, and she said it would ruin her, and she said she would lose her job, and she said people would hate her. I told her people don't hate someone because of one bad act. They hate someone because of a pattern, and she was building the pattern in real time by refusing honesty. She accused me of wanting to humiliate her, and I told her I didn't want humiliation. I wanted correction, because the world had been given a distorted version of events, and distortion is just another kind of cheating. That night, I received a message from Mara that was short and strangely formal. She told me Ethan had been put on administrative leave pending an HR review, and she told me he was claiming Lila was obsessed with him, and he was claiming he made a mistake, and he was implying she coerced him emotionally. The man had cheated and now wanted to be framed as the victim of a woman's attention, which is the kind of hypocrisy that usually gets rewarded if nobody challenges it. Mara asked me if I had anything that showed Lila wasn't chasing him, but that the affair was mutual and recent. I stared at her message and felt the dilemma, because I had evidence that Lila cheated, but I didn't have direct proof of Ethan's behavior beyond his text to me and the pattern of shared timing. Then my mind went back to something I had ignored because I didn't want to look too deeply into it. Lila's phone. Not hacking, not spying, just the basic reality that when two people share a house, you see things, and she had been careless. I remembered a lock screen preview I had seen weeks ago while she left her phone on the counter, a message from E that said he missed her, and she had snatched it up too quickly, laughing like it was nothing. At the time, I had believed her, because belief is the default setting in a marriage, and now that memory felt like a gift I had refused to unwrap. I didn't take her phone. I didn't demand passwords. I didn't do anything illegal or invasive because I didn't need to. I only needed her to keep being herself, and people like Lila cannot resist trying to control the situation. She came downstairs late, phone in hand, and she started talking again about how we could fix this, how she could prove she was done with Ethan, how she could block him. I told her to show me, because if she was going to claim she was cutting him off, then the act should be visible. She hesitated, and then she opened her messages and started scrolling. And in that moment, she forgot I was watching as carefully as a man counting exits. I saw Ethan's name, and I saw a thread filled with frantic texts, and I saw one line that made my stomach go cold in a very specific way, because it wasn't romantic, it was logistical. It said they needed to sync stories, and it mentioned the party, and it mentioned the driver, and it mentioned the HR call. I didn't read more than I could see in that brief glance because I didn't need to, and because I didn't want her to later claim I invaded her privacy. The point was simple and lethal. Ethan wasn't a passive victim, he was an active co-conspirator in narrative management. I asked her to stop scrolling and set the phone down, and I asked her calmly why Ethan was talking about syncing stories. Her eyes widened, and she tried to yank the phone back, and when she did, her finger slipped, and the screen flashed a notification preview again, giving me the same line a second time, like the universe wanted to be sure I saw it. She started stammering, saying he was just panicking, saying he was afraid, saying he was trying to protect his marriage. And I almost smiled, because she was admitting exactly what she thought would make him look human. I told her that line alone proved this wasn't just a mistake, it was coordinated deception, and I told her coordination is what HR calls intent. I didn't need to copy her messages, I didn't need to photograph her screen, I didn't need to do anything that would cross a line. I only needed her to admit, out loud, that Ethan was trying to align their stories, because an admission in a calm conversation becomes a memory she cannot later erase without contradicting herself. I asked her again why he was doing it, and she said, in a small voice, that he didn't want to lose his job, and he didn't want Mara to leave him, and he didn't want people to think he was the kind of man who cheats. I stared at her and said, flatly, that he was exactly the kind of man who cheats, and now he was also the kind of man who lies after. That night I texted Mara, not with speculation, but with the truth I could responsibly share. I told her Ethan contacted me directly trying to manage the narrative, and I told her Lila admitted Ethan wanted to sync stories once HR got involved. I didn't quote the text. I didn't mention seeing the thread. I simply conveyed the existence of coordination and the timing of it, and I told her to share that with her attorney. Mara replied with a single word, "Thanks." And then the silence that followed felt heavy, because once the legal machinery starts, it doesn't stop, because someone wants comfort. When I finally went to bed, I didn't sleep well, because the house felt like a set, a place where roles were being rehearsed. Lila was practicing remorse, Ethan was practicing victimhood, Mara was practicing restraint, and I was practicing something colder than anger. I was practicing precision, because precision is the only way to survive a liar who knows how to cry on cue. And as I lay in the dark, I realized that the freeway moment wasn't the harshest thing I had done. It was simply the first moment I stopped protecting her from the discomfort of her own choices, which meant it was the moment she would never forgive me for. The third day was when Lila tried to take control back, and she did it the way she always did when she felt cornered, by creating a version of reality where she was the fragile one and I was the cruel one. I woke up to the sound of her on the phone in the kitchen, voice low, sweet, and shaky, telling someone she didn't feel safe, telling someone she didn't know what I might do, telling someone she was scared because I had abandoned her, and now I was acting cold. I stood in the hallway and listened long enough to confirm what I needed, which was not the identity of the person she called, but the shape of the narrative. She was building a soft shield in advance, the kind of shield people build when they plan to do something ugly and want to look innocent while doing it. When she ended the call and saw me, she jumped like she had been caught stealing, which in a way she had. She asked how long I had been standing there, and I told her long enough to hear her practicing fear. She said I was twisting things, and I told her she was inventing things. She tried to escalate, raising her voice, asking why I was spying, and I didn't bite because escalation was the hook. Instead, I told her we would now communicate in writing about any serious matters, and I told her that if she felt unsafe, she could leave, because I wasn't going to beg her to stay in a home she had already poisoned. She accused me of trying to kick her out, and I told her I was offering her the exact freedom she apparently needed. She asked where she would go, and I reminded her she had asked me that on the freeway too, which was a detail she hated because it made her look exactly as entitled as she was. She said she had nowhere, and I said she had friends, and I said she had a lover with a house, and I said she had options she didn't want to admit because admitting them would force her to own her choices in public. That's when she snapped, because I touched the one thing she wanted to preserve, the illusion that she was still a respectable wife who made one mistake. Later that morning, I received an email from the party host, a cheerful message with a forced tone, saying they hoped everything was okay and asking if we could clear up what happened, because people were uncomfortable and rumors were getting weird. I stared at the email and felt the shift from private mess to public inconvenience, because once a social circle gets spooked, they either demand the truth or they punish the person who refuses to provide it. I knew Lila would prefer I stay quiet so she could keep her version alive. I also knew silence would make me look like the unstable husband who abandoned his wife on the freeway for no reason. So I decided to do what I had been doing since the confession: small, lawful truths, released with precision. I replied to the host with a short factual explanation that did not include theatrics. I said Lila had admitted to cheating the night before, during the ride to the party. I said I got out of the car and canceled the ride. I said she was removed by the driver after the cancellation. I said the situation was not a misunderstanding, and I would not discuss details beyond that. Then I attached nothing, because I wasn't trying to dump evidence into a friend's inbox. I was simply refusing to let Lila's omission turn me into the villain. I hit send and felt that clean sense of action again, because the moment you stop guarding a liar's image, you start breathing differently. An hour later, the host replied with a stunned, careful message saying they were sorry and asking if Lila was okay, and I told them she was physically fine and emotionally manipulative, though I kept the second part to myself. I could feel the rumor network shifting, because now people had a clear cause, and with cause comes moral clarity, and with moral clarity comes social consequences. Lila came downstairs shortly after, phone in hand, eyes sharp with anger, and she demanded to know what I had told people. I told her the truth, and I told her she didn't get to control which parts of her confession were allowed to exist. She started pacing, saying I was ruining her friendships, saying people would judge her forever, saying she couldn't believe I would do this to her. I watched her spiral and noticed something that would have broken my heart a week ago, because it was proof that my instincts had been right about her priorities. She was more terrified of being judged than she was ashamed of what she did. Shame says, I hurt someone and I need to repair it. Terror says, I might lose my status and I need to prevent it. Lila was terrified, not ashamed, and that meant she would keep lying whenever lying offered protection. That afternoon, Dana, the attorney, sent me a draft separation document, and she told me to deliver it in a neutral way, preferably with a witness nearby or in writing, because the moment paperwork enters a messy situation, people start rewriting memory. I printed the document and placed it in a plain envelope, because dramatic folders are for people who want theater, and I wanted enforceability. Lila watched me from the doorway and asked what it was. I told her it was a proposed separation agreement, and I told her she could review it and respond through counsel if she wanted. She asked if I was threatening her, and I said no, I was formalizing reality. She took the envelope with shaking hands, opened it, and started scanning, and I saw her eyes widen when she reached the section about shared accounts and public disparagement. She asked why I included a clause about disparagement, and I told her because she was already telling people she didn't feel safe, which was a soft accusation meant to make me look dangerous. She denied it immediately, and I told her denial was pointless because she had said it in the kitchen while I listened. She went pale, and she snapped that I was eavesdropping, and I said I was hearing her speak in my house, which is not the same thing as spying. She slammed the papers down and said she wouldn't sign anything that silenced her, and I told her she was free to speak, but she was not free to lie without consequence. That was when she threatened me, not with violence, but with reputation, the weapon she understood best. She said people already thought I was unstable because of the freeway incident, and she said if I kept pushing her, she would tell them more. I asked her what more meant, and she hesitated, because she didn't want to admit she planned to fabricate. She said she would tell them about how cold I was, how controlling I was, how she felt trapped. I nodded, because that was the script I had expected, the script designed to make her affair look like a coping mechanism instead of a choice. I told her if she chose that route, I would respond with documentation, not insults, and I would not do it privately. The word documentation made her flinch again, and that flinch gave me a strange comfort, because it meant she still understood paper more than she understood morality. She stormed upstairs and slammed the door, and I sat at the table and added another line to my ledger because I was keeping track of threats too, the soft kind, the kind that starts as implication and ends as accusation when desperation rises. Later that day, my phone rang and the number was unfamiliar, but the voice was not. It was Ethan, calling now instead of texting, which meant he was either brave or desperate, and men like him are rarely brave. He asked if we could talk man to man, which was already insulting because he had not acted like a man when he climbed into my marriage. I told him I had no interest in conversation and every interest in record. He said he didn't want anyone's life ruined, and I told him he should have considered that before he touched someone else's wife. He said Lila was unstable and he was worried about what she might do, and I almost laughed, because he was trying to make himself look like the sensible adult in a mess he helped create. I told him to stop contacting me directly and to communicate through attorneys if needed, and I told him any further contact would be documented. He tried one last tactic, lowering his voice, calling me buddy, saying he understood I was hurt, saying he respected me. I told him respect doesn't arrive after betrayal, it arrives before, and then I hung up. The call left a residue in my chest, not because of anger, but because I realized Ethan was not just afraid of divorce, he was afraid of exposure, and fear makes people reckless. Reckless people create evidence without meaning to, and I knew the next days would likely bring another mistake from him or Lila, because pressure squeezes the truth out through the smallest cracks. That evening, Calvin texted again, saying the group chat was blowing up because someone had posted a vague message about toxic husbands and women having to do what they have to do, and everyone was arguing in the comments. I didn't have to ask who posted it. Lila had always loved passive aggression dressed as empowerment. I asked Calvin for a screenshot, and he sent it, and there it was. Lila's post, carefully worded, with no mention of cheating, no mention of confession, just a narrative of victimhood designed to recruit sympathy. I stared at it and felt something turn cold and steady inside me, because now she was not just lying by omission, she was actively shaping public perception against me. I took a screenshot of the post, saved it, and then I did something I had avoided until now, because I didn't want to be dragged into online mud. I wrote a short reply under her post, not emotional, not attacking, just factual, because facts are the one thing that cannot be argued without looking dishonest. I said she confessed in the Uber ride to the party that she cheated the night before. I said I exited the car and canceled the ride. I said she was removed by the driver after the cancellation. I said I would not discuss it further online and would handle matters privately through counsel. Then I logged out and set my phone down because I wasn't there to win likes. I was there to stop a lie from hardening into community truth. Within minutes, Calvin told me the comments changed tone because now people understood what her post had been hiding. Some friends went silent. Some asked her directly if it was true. Some defended her anyway, because some people always defend the person who cries first. Lila came downstairs with her face twisted in fury, phone in hand, and she accused me of humiliating her on purpose. I told her she humiliated herself the night she cheated, and she intensified it the moment she tried to paint me as a villain to protect her image. She started screaming that I was ruining her life, and I told her she was watching the cost of her choices arrive on schedule. For a moment, she looked like she might throw something, not because she wanted to hurt me physically, but because she wanted the scene. She wanted to be able to say later that she lost control because I provoked her. I stayed seated, hands flat on the table, and I kept my voice level, because the most terrifying thing you can do to a manipulator is refuse to perform with them. I told her we were done talking for the night, and that any further communication should be by text or email. She stood there breathing hard, then turned and went upstairs, and I listened to her slam doors like a teenager. which would have been funny if it wasn't my actual life. After the house went quiet, I opened my laptop and wrote an email to myself summarizing the day, because self-records matter when reality becomes contested. I noted her phone call about feeling unsafe. I noted her threat to tell people more if I pushed her. I noted her social media post and my factual reply. I noted Ethan's call and his attempt to shift blame and manage narrative. I attached the screenshots and saved everything in one folder, not because I enjoyed building this archive, but because archives are what survive when stories get rewritten. I went to bed late, and as I stared at the ceiling, I realized that the freeway moment had become a symbol, not just a consequence. In her mind, it was proof I was cruel. In my mind, it was proof I refused to enable. And in the minds of everyone watching, it was now a test of which narrative made more sense: the woman who cheated and confessed, or the husband who reacted by stepping out of the moving lie. The real fight was no longer about the affair itself, because the affair was done. The fight was about who would be believed when the consequences landed, and I could feel with a strange, calm certainty that the next confrontation would not happen in our house, because our house had become too small for the story she was trying to sell. The fourth day was when the consequences stopped being theoretical and started knocking on the door in other people's hands, because once a story leaves your house, it stops belonging to you, and it starts belonging to whoever can repeat it the loudest. I was making coffee when my phone lit up with a notification from our bank, the kind of bland little alert that usually means groceries or a utility bill. But this time, it was a charge that didn't fit her new posture of remorse. A boutique hotel deposit with a name I didn't recognize and a timestamp that sat right in the middle of an afternoon she claimed she was at work. I stared at it for a moment and felt that familiar shift inside me, that movement from hurt into clarity, because the cruelest part of betrayal is not the act itself. It is the way it forces you to become a person who checks timestamps. I didn't storm upstairs and wave the phone like a weapon, because I had learned that emotional reactions were just fuel for her narrative, and I had no interest in feeding the machine that she kept trying to build around my supposed instability. Instead, I took a screenshot of the alert on my own phone, then I logged into the account and pulled the transaction line that matched it, because a single alert can be dismissed as a glitch, but a statement line has the stubbornness of reality. I printed the page, not because I loved paper, but because paper makes people behave differently, and it makes liars choose between denial and explanation in a way that text messages never do. When Lila came downstairs, she looked like someone who hadn't slept, but she was dressed as if she had, hair smoothed, makeup precise, posture controlled, which meant she was preparing for a role. She asked if we could talk, and I told her we could talk about logistics, because the emotional part of this marriage was now a closed account. She tried to soften her voice, telling me she felt attacked online and that I had embarrassed her. And I told her she embarrassed herself the moment she chose cheating as a form of entertainment and confession as a form of absolution. She flinched at the word entertainment, because it implied she had enjoyed it, and that implication was too close to the truth for her comfort. I placed the printed bank line on the table between us like a neutral object, and I asked her to explain the hotel deposit. She stared at it, then stared at me, and I watched her mind calculate which lie would cost her the least. She said it was a work thing, a conference deposit, a team event that moved locations, and she said it too quickly, which told me it was preloaded. I asked her to name the conference, and she hesitated, because lies are easy until someone asks for nouns. She tried to take the paper, and I held it down with my fingers, not aggressive, just firm, because I wasn't handing her the only copy she could destroy. She said she didn't know the name because her assistant handled it, and I nodded, because that was the kind of vague excuse that sounds plausible to someone who wants to believe her. Then I asked her a second question, one that had nothing to do with the conference and everything to do with the pattern. I asked her why the hotel deposit was charged to our shared account when she had just told me she wanted privacy and space and separation. Her jaw tightened. She said she wasn't thinking. She said she panicked. She said she didn't mean to, and then she tried to pivot back into tears, because tears were her favorite exit. I told her she was thinking enough to post online, thinking enough to frame herself as afraid, thinking enough to warn Ethan to sync stories, so I didn't buy the idea that her fingers just slipped on a payment method. I asked her again, slowly, and I watched her face change from sadness into irritation, because my calm was blocking her usual escape routes. She finally admitted that the deposit was for a room she had reserved weeks ago, and she said she canceled it, and she said the deposit was just a delayed reversal. That explanation had the smoothness of something rehearsed, and I almost admired the craft, because she wasn't stupid, she was simply dishonest with discipline. I told her I would verify it through the merchant, using only the information that belonged to me as the account holder, because it was my right to know where my money went. She snapped that I was controlling, and I told her financial transparency is not control, it's basic adulthood, and she had been very fond of using that word until it stopped serving her. That afternoon I called the bank and asked for a simple confirmation of what the merchant category was and whether the charge was a deposit or a finalized payment, because I didn't need special access. I just needed the basic facts any account owner can request. The representative confirmed it was a lodging deposit, not a reversal, and my chest went tight in that calm, clean way that happens when suspicion turns into confirmation. I didn't feel surprised anymore because surprise belongs to the version of me who believed marriage meant shared reality, and that version of me had been left on the freeway with her. I asked the representative to email a confirmation of the transaction details, and when it arrived, I saved the email header and printed it, because her lies were now colliding with third-party records. While I was doing that, Mara texted me again, shorter than before, telling me HR wanted to speak with her in person and that Ethan was now claiming he and Lila only had a brief lapse and that Lila was the one who pursued him aggressively. She asked me bluntly whether I believed Ethan, and I stared at her question longer than I should have, because it wasn't really a question about Ethan, it was a question about how badly she wanted a clean narrative. I told her I believed Ethan was doing what weak men do when they get caught, which is to push blame onto the woman and pretend their own hands were forced. I told her I had reason to believe they were coordinating stories, and I told her she should assume he would lie until he ran out of oxygen. Mara replied that she was done being polite, and she asked if I would speak to HR as a witness to Ethan contacting me. I hesitated, not because I wanted to protect Ethan, but because I understood how easily Lila would use any HR involvement to accuse me of sabotaging her life. Then I realized she was already accusing me of that without any evidence, because liars don't wait for facts, they manufacture motives. I told Mara I would provide a written statement, limited to what I personally experienced, and I told her I would not speculate or exaggerate. She replied with a simple acknowledgement, and I felt a strange sympathy for her, because she was now watching her husband do the same thing my wife did, confess just enough to appear honest while hiding the uglier parts. That evening, Lila announced she was going out to clear her head, and she said it with a tone that implied I needed to grant permission, like we were still in a normal marriage where checking in was a courtesy instead of a cover. I told her she was free to go, and I reminded her that spending from the shared account was no longer acceptable without mutual agreement. She stared at me, then smiled with that thin edge she used when she wanted to punish me quietly. She said she didn't need my money, and she walked out, and I watched her leave like a man watching a storm cloud drift toward someone else's neighborhood. She was gone for 3 hours, and when she returned, she was too calm, which told me she had been practicing again. She said she had spoken to her sister, and she said her sister thought I was being cruel, and she said her sister thought I should get over it because at least Lila had been honest. I laughed once, a short, dry sound I couldn't stop, because the idea that cheating becomes admirable if you confess in an Uber was the kind of moral gymnastics only a family member could perform. I told Lila that honesty would have been not cheating, or confessing before the party while standing in our kitchen, not while moving toward a social event where she wanted to appear normal. Lila's face tightened, and she asked if I really thought she planned it, and I told her I didn't have to think it, because her behavior after the confession proved she cared more about narrative than repair. Then she made the mistake I had been waiting for, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because mistakes expose intent. She said sharply that Ethan was ruining her life by lying, and she said she didn't deserve to be thrown under the bus. The way she said it confirmed what she had tried to hide, which was that she was still emotionally invested in Ethan's behavior, still viewing him as a partner in a shared crisis rather than a symptom of her choices. I asked her why she cared what Ethan said if she was truly done with him, and she tried to walk it back, but her eyes betrayed her because she was terrified of losing the only ally who could confirm her version of events. I told her I had spoken to counsel and that any further communication should be in writing, and she asked if I planned to destroy her, and I said I planned to stop her from destroying me. She said she felt trapped, and I reminded her she could leave whenever she wanted, and she said she couldn't leave because then people would assume she was guilty, and I almost applauded the honesty hidden inside that sentence. She wasn't staying because she loved me. She was staying because she wanted to control optics, and optics, in her mind, were worth more than truth. The next morning, the consequences arrived in the form of a knock at the door and a man holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as building management, polite and firm, and he said there had been complaints about shouting late at night. I blinked at him because we hadn't been shouting late at night, not the way he described, not the kind of shouting that draws management. Lila stepped behind me, and I felt her presence like a needle, because I understood instantly what she had done. She had made a call, she had planted a complaint, and she had created an external record that suggested our home was volatile, which would later support her "I don't feel safe" script without requiring proof. I told the man there had been no shouting, and I asked for the time and date of the complaint. He glanced at his clipboard and gave me a timestamp from a night when Lila had slammed doors and raised her voice, and when I had remained quiet. I asked who reported it, and he said he couldn't disclose names, and I told him I understood. Then I asked him for a copy of the complaint record for my own files, because as a tenant, I had a right to know what accusations existed about my household. He hesitated, then said he could email a summary. I thanked him and watched him leave, then I turned and looked at Lila, and she didn't even bother pretending confusion. She said she had called because she needed a paper trail, and she said it like it was a normal concept, like she was discussing insurance. My stomach tightened in a way that made everything feel sharper, because now we weren't in a marriage crisis, we were in a reputational war. I asked her calmly if she understood what she was doing, and she said she was protecting herself, and she said she had to, because I was unpredictable. I asked her to name one unpredictable thing I had done besides leaving an Uber after she confessed to cheating, and she couldn't, because she didn't have facts, she had narrative. I told her she had just escalated the situation into something that would have consequences she could not control, because false records have a way of multiplying when they meet legal processes. She smiled, a small, ugly smile, and she said, "Maybe now I would be nicer." That was the moment my anger stopped feeling hot and started feeling cold, because coercion disguised as vulnerability is still coercion, and I was no longer dealing with a woman who made a mistake. I was dealing with a woman who was willing to manufacture fear if it improved her position. That afternoon, Dana called and told me to keep my distance inside the house, to communicate in writing, to avoid being alone with Lila in closed rooms, and to consider moving out temporarily if it was safe and strategic. I told her I wouldn't abandon my own home just because my wife wanted a storyline, and Dana said, calmly, that abandoning the home is not the same as choosing a controlled environment, and she was right. Control was now the only language that mattered, because Lila had made it clear she would create records and call them truth. So I packed a small bag and moved into the guest room, not because I was afraid of her physically, but because I was done sharing space with someone who treated my presence as a tool. I left the door slightly open at night, because closed doors create private scenarios, and private scenarios create accusations. It was a miserable way to live, but it was also a clean way to survive. And as I lay there in the dark, listening to her pacing in the hall like a person rehearsing a scene, I realized the next step wasn't about proving she cheated anymore, because she had confessed. The next step was about exposing the machinery behind her new story, the one she was building to make me look like the villain, and I already knew exactly where she would try to deploy it. The fifth day was when I learned that Lila's talent wasn't lying, because anyone can lie. It was timing, because she knew exactly when to release a new piece of narrative so that it landed before you could respond. I woke up to an email from building management, a polite summary of the noise complaint, and I stared at it with a bitterness that tasted like metal, because it was now a written record that could be waved around later by someone who wanted to prove I was volatile. I saved it, printed it, and added it to my folder, because I had accepted that I was now living in a world where my life needed an appendix. Then my phone buzzed with a message from a mutual friend, the kind of person who loves to play peacemaker because it makes them feel important. She asked if we could all meet later, just to talk, just to clear the air, because people were worried. I read the message twice and felt the trap forming, because group meetings are never about clearing the air. They are about controlling whose version becomes the group's memory. Lila had likely been calling people, crying to them, implying danger, setting the stage for a social intervention where she could sit with watery eyes while I looked cold and defensive. The idea was simple. If she could make the room feel like it needed to protect her, then the room would punish me for facts. I replied that I would not attend any informal group meeting and that I would communicate through counsel, and I kept it short, because explanations are where people start negotiating your boundaries. A few minutes later, the same friend replied that I was being extreme and that Lila was really struggling, and I didn't respond because I no longer cared about the comfort of people who wanted me to make things easier for her. Comfort was the currency she traded in, and I was out of money. Around noon, Mara called me, voice tight and exhausted, and she told me HR had interviewed Ethan again. She said Ethan was now claiming the night Lila cheated was the first time anything happened, and he was claiming it was spontaneous, and he was claiming he regretted it immediately. Mara said she didn't believe him, but she said HR wanted more than belief. They wanted corroboration, and she asked me, carefully, if I had anything that showed it wasn't just a one-night lapse. I told her I had a bank deposit for a boutique hotel in the middle of an afternoon Lila claimed she was working, and I told her I had reason to believe Ethan and Lila were coordinating stories. Mara went silent for a moment, and then she said something that made my stomach drop, because it was the natural next step in the kind of cowardice Ethan was practicing. Mara said Ethan was implying that if Lila was unstable, then maybe her confession was unreliable, and maybe the whole cheating claim was exaggerated, and maybe the real problem was Lila's marriage being toxic. I almost laughed again, because the man was trying to weaponize the very narrative Lila was building, which meant they were either coordinating more deeply than I thought, or they were simply the same kind of person who reached for the same dirty tools when pressure arrived. Mara asked if I would be willing to provide a written statement about Ethan contacting me, and I said yes, and I asked her to send me the HR email address so I could submit it directly, because I was not going to let my words be filtered through anyone else's interpretation. I drafted the statement in plain language, factual and limited, and I described Ethan's text to me, Ethan's call, and his attempt to manage narrative. I described that Lila admitted he wanted to sync stories once HR became involved. I did not speculate about motives or timeline beyond what I knew. I attached screenshots of Ethan's text and the call log showing his number and timestamp, because those were my records, not hers, and I sent the email. When I hit send, I felt a grim satisfaction, because I wasn't doing this to punish Ethan. I was doing it to prevent him from turning Mara into the villain of his own choices. That evening, Lila tried to force the social meeting anyway. She told me her sister and 2 friends were coming over, and she told me it would be better if I participated, because people needed reassurance. I asked her what needed reassurance, specifically, and she said people were worried about her, and she said they didn't understand why I was being so cold. I asked if she had told them she cheated, and she said she had told them we were having issues. I nodded, because that was exactly the type of soft lie that allows the listener to fill in whatever makes them feel comfortable, and most listeners fill in a version that blames the person who looks calm. I told her no one was coming into the house to mediate my marriage, and I told her if she wanted witnesses, she could use the proper channels through attorneys. She accused me of isolating her, and I told her she had isolated herself the moment she chose another man's bed over her vows. She said I was cruel, and I told her cruelty is cheating, and then trying to make the betrayed spouse look dangerous so that you can avoid consequences. She stepped closer, eyes bright with anger, and she said she would tell them whatever she had to tell them to protect herself, and I said that was exactly the problem because it meant truth was optional to her. At 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Lila opened the door with a trembling smile, and her sister walked in first, followed by 2 friends who looked uncomfortable, like they had been recruited into a scene they didn't fully understand. They sat in the living room in a loose circle, the kind of circle meant to look gentle, and Lila sat in the center like she was the patient at the heart of an intervention. Her sister looked at me with the kind of preloaded contempt that comes from believing a story without hearing the other side, and she asked, bluntly, why I had abandoned Lila on the freeway. I didn't argue with the framing, because arguing about framing is how you lose the room. I answered in calm, simple sentences, and I said Lila confessed she cheated on me the night before while we were in an Uber to a party. I said I exited the car and canceled the ride on my app. I said the driver removed her after the cancellation. I said she then texted me asking how she was supposed to get home. The room went quiet, and I watched their faces change, because suddenly the freeway story wasn't a funny anecdote or a cruelty, it was a consequence attached to a cause. Lila tried to interject, saying it was complicated, saying it was a mistake, saying she had been under stress, and I let her, because people need to watch a liar try to smooth a hard fact. Her sister asked if it was true, and Lila said yes, but she said it with the kind of yes that tries to look brave, the kind of yes that expects applause for honesty. One of the friends looked at her with something like disgust, and the other looked at me with awkward pity, because nobody likes to be invited to a performance and then realize it's real. Lila's sister pivoted instantly, because family loyalty is not about truth. It's about protecting the person you came for. She said, sharply, that leaving someone on the side of the freeway was dangerous and unforgivable, and she said it didn't matter what Lila had done. I looked at her and told her it absolutely mattered, because actions have context, and context is the difference between cruelty and refusal to enable. Then I said something I knew would make Lila's eyes flash, because it hit the soft spot of her current strategy. I told them Lila had already started building a paper trail suggesting I was volatile, including a false noise complaint to building management. Lila snapped that it wasn't false, and I asked her calmly when exactly the shouting happened and what exactly was said. She couldn't answer without inventing details, and inventing details in front of witnesses is risky, because details can be challenged. Her sister stared at her, confused, and asked if she had filed a complaint. Lila said she had called because she felt unsafe, and she said it with that fragile tone again, trying to make the room lean toward her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I simply reached into my folder, pulled out the building management email summary, and placed it on the coffee table. I told them I had been advised by counsel to document everything, and I told them that I was not interested in punishing Lila, but I was interested in preventing false narratives from becoming records. The room went very still, because paper changes the temperature, and suddenly this wasn't just a relationship conflict, it was a dispute with consequences. Lila's friend asked why I had a folder, and I told her because Lila was already making public statements that omitted the cheating while implying I was dangerous. Lila tried to defend herself, saying she only wanted support, saying she was scared because I was cold, and I told her coldness is not danger, it's boundaries. Her sister looked at me like she wanted to hate me, but she couldn't fully commit because the facts were sitting on the table, and facts are awkward in a room built for emotion. Then Lila made another mistake, the kind that happens when someone loses control of a scripted scene. She said she never meant for Ethan to get dragged into this. The name fell out of her mouth like a coin from a torn pocket, and the room snapped to attention because she hadn't told them the affair partner's identity. Her sister demanded to know who Ethan was, and Lila stammered that he was nobody, that it didn't matter, and her friend asked if Ethan was married. Lila tried to wave it away, but the questions came faster now, because once people realize they've been manipulated, they start asking the questions they should have asked earlier. I told them Ethan was married, and I told them his wife knew, and I told them HR was involved, because the affair had spilled into professional consequences. Lila's sister stood up, angry and shocked, not at me, but at Lila, because betrayal is easier to excuse when it is vague, and it is harder when it has a name, a wife, and collateral damage. Lila started crying in earnest now, but even her crying felt tactical, because she kept glancing at the room as if checking whether the tears were working. The meeting ended badly, which was inevitable, because it had begun as a trap. Her sister dragged her to the door, telling her they were leaving, telling her she needed to come with them, telling her she couldn't stay here if she felt unsafe, and Lila hesitated in the doorway, torn between two desires that couldn't coexist, wanting the sympathy of being the fragile one, and wanting the control of staying in the house to manage optics. She looked back at me with a mix of hatred and fear, and I realized she didn't hate me because I had been cruel. She hated me because I had refused to play the villain in the story she needed. After they left, the house felt hollow and charged, like a room after a storm. My phone buzzed with a new message from Mara, and it was short, but it carried weight. She said HR thanked her for the statement I provided, and she said they were moving fast now. Then she added one more line that made my stomach tighten again, because it meant the next escalation wouldn't come from Lila's tears, it would come from her desperation. Mara said Ethan had asked HR to consider that Lila was emotionally unstable, and that I had abandoned her dangerously, and he was implying that Lila might accuse me of something if things got worse. I stared at the message and felt the future snap into focus, because now I could see the path clearly. Lila was building a fear narrative for leverage, and Ethan was encouraging it to save himself. Two liars were about to converge on the same tactic, and that tactic wasn't cheating anymore, it was character assassination. And I knew, with the calm certainty of a man watching the next wave crest, that Lila's next move would not be another post or another complaint, because she had already played those cards. Her next move would be formal, and it would arrive with a date and a time printed at the top, and I would have to be ready before it did. The formal move arrived the next morning in an envelope that looked ordinary until I saw the return address and realized she had finally done what her new personality demanded, which was to turn a private mess into an official story with letterhead. The petition was not a divorce filing yet, not the clean legal end people imagine when they say the word separation, but something dirtier and more tactical, because it was framed as a request for temporary protection and exclusive use of the home while things were unstable. She had taken the building noise complaint, her sister's outrage about the freeway, and whatever version of my calm she had described as cold, and she had braided them into a narrative that implied risk without having to prove violence. I read every line twice, not because the wording was complicated, but because it was designed to make an outsider feel a certain emotion, and I wanted to see how she was painting me when I was not in the room to resist the brush. She wrote that I abandoned her in a dangerous area after she confessed to a mistake, which was an interesting choice of language because it made cheating sound like spilling coffee. She wrote that I had become controlling about finances after the confession, which was true only if you define controlling as noticing that hotel deposits do not belong in a remorse narrative. She wrote that I kept records and folders, and that it made her fear escalation, as if documentation itself were a threat rather than a response to a person who had already manufactured a complaint. Dana's advice was simple and sharp, because that's what you pay for when your life is being rewritten by someone else. She told me not to react emotionally, not to call Lila names, not to plead, and not to expect the court to detect sarcasm, because sarcasm reads like aggression on paper. She told me to respond with verifiable facts, and she reminded me that Lila's confession in the Uber was a gift she could not take back, because admissions are stubborn things when you put them in the right format. She asked if I had anything in writing from Lila that referenced the confession, and I told her I had her text from 10 minutes later asking how she was supposed to get home, which mattered because it anchored the freeway story to her own acknowledgement. I pulled up the message and stared at it for a long moment, because it was so pathetic in the way selfish messages are. A person asking for rescue from consequences without acknowledging the act that caused them. I took screenshots with the timestamp visible. Then I exported the conversation so it could not be accused of being edited, and I printed it as well, because in court, paper has a different gravity than a glowing screen. I also pulled the ride cancellation confirmation from my app, the one that showed the trip ended early and the exact time it happened, because I wasn't going to argue about the freeway like it was a moral philosophy debate when I could show it as a sequence of recorded actions. Dana helped me draft a response that did not insult Lila, because judges don't care about your feelings unless your feelings are tied to a concrete risk, and my feelings were tied to something else entirely, which was her willingness to invent. We described the timeline in plain language, and we attached evidence like we were building a small bridge from reality to the page. We included the building management email and noted that the complaint did not match any actual shouting initiated by me, and we stated that Lila had openly said she wanted a paper trail, which was her own admission of intent. We included the bank alert and the statement line for the hotel deposit, not because the judge cared about adultery in a moral sense, but because it demonstrated ongoing deception and misuse of shared funds while she was claiming fear and instability. When Dana asked if there were any witnesses who could speak to my demeanor since the confession, I almost laughed, because my demeanor had been the most boring part of this entire story, which was the point. Calm is not evidence of danger, but when someone claims they fear you, your calm becomes a weapon they use against you by calling it cold. I told Dana about the forced living room intervention with Lila's sister and friends, and I told her I had not raised my voice once, and Dana said that was useful if any of those people were willing to say it. The question was whether they would, because people who arrive as your wife's supporters do not love switching sides, even when the facts make their original side look stupid. That afternoon, I received another message, this time from Lila's sister, and it was shorter than her earlier outrage, which told me something had shifted. She wrote that she did not agree with what Lila had done, and she wrote that she felt blindsided, and then she wrote that Lila had asked her to help with paperwork, which was the sister version of being recruited into a scheme. She asked what I planned to do, and I replied that I planned to tell the truth with documentation, and I asked if she would be willing to confirm that Lila had not disclosed the affair partner's identity until she slipped and said his name in front of everyone. I kept the message neutral and careful, because I wasn't trying to turn her into my soldier. I was trying to place her in the position where she had to choose between lying for Lila or staying honest for herself. She didn't reply right away, and that silence told me she was being pressured in real time. Lila's talent, once again, was timing, and I could imagine her calling her sister with tears and drama, calling me cold and dangerous, insisting the paperwork was necessary. I pictured the sister pacing in her apartment with the phone pressed to her ear, torn between family loyalty and the uncomfortable truth she had watched with her own eyes. It was amazing how quickly a person learns what kind of loyalty they are surrounded by when consequences arrive. That evening, Lila tried to talk to me like we were negotiating a business contract, which was fitting because she treated marriage like a public relations campaign. She asked if we could settle this quietly, and she said she didn't want things to get ugly. I told her she had already made it ugly the moment she filed for protection without any actual incident, because now we were in the realm of accusations. She said she did it because she felt unsafe, and I asked her, calmly, to name one specific unsafe act I had committed since the confession. She said it was the way I looked at her, and I almost admired the audacity because she was trying to turn my disappointment into a threat. Then she offered the real trade, the thing hidden under the word quietly. She said if I moved out and gave her the home temporarily, she would stop the request, and she said she would tell people we were just taking space. I stared at her for a moment and felt something like disgust settle behind my ribs because she was bargaining with narrative like it was currency. I told her I would not surrender my home or my integrity to buy silence from someone who manufactured fear, and I told her that if she wanted to end this, she could withdraw the filing and proceed with a normal separation process. She asked if I was threatening her, and I told her I was refusing her, and refusal is not a threat no matter how badly she needed it to be. The next day, Mara called with an update that made the entire thing feel like a converging storm. HR had scheduled a formal meeting, and it was not the quiet, let's talk interview anymore, but a documented review with a compliance representative present. Mara said Ethan's story was collapsing because his phone records and his time logs did not match the version he had offered, and she said HR had asked him directly whether he had contacted me to coordinate, which meant my statement had landed. She said Ethan was panicking, and she said he was now implying Lila might say something about me to distract from his own misconduct. Mara sounded tired in a way that was deeper than anger, because she was watching her marriage become a battlefield, and she hadn't chosen to enlist. I told Mara to keep everything in writing, to refuse vague conversations, and to insist on documented summaries of any HR claims. Mara said she had already started, and then she said something that sharpened everything. She said HR had asked whether Lila also worked at the company in any capacity, and Mara didn't know why, and I felt my jaw tighten because I did know why. Lila had a habit of turning private dramas into professional pressure, and if she could tie my name to any claim of volatility, she could try to poison Ethan's case by suggesting the complainant's spouse was unstable, and thus the complainant's account was compromised. It was a dirty strategy, and it was predictable, and it made me understand that my response in court could not be just defensive. I had to expose her tactic without sounding like a man complaining about his wife, because nobody respects that man, and courts don't reward him. Dana's phrase echoed in my head again, the one she used like a rule of physics: facts, not feelings. So I built a simple timeline, not dramatic, not poetic, just dates and actions, and I printed it and signed it, because a signed timeline creates a point of reference that lies have to work around. On the day of the hearing, I dressed like I was attending a meeting that mattered, because I was, and I walked into the courthouse with a folder that held nothing but household-level truth. Lila arrived with her lawyer and her sister, and I noticed her sister would not meet my eyes, which told me she had chosen a side or she had been instructed to appear neutral. Lila looked composed, the way she always looked when she wanted strangers to see her as the reasonable one, and when she saw my folder, her eyes flicked toward it with an irritation she failed to hide. She wanted a narrative contest, not a documentation contest, because documentation is where she loses. Inside the small courtroom, everything felt both petty and enormous, because you're essentially arguing about your life in a room that handles dozens of lives in the same afternoon. Lila's lawyer spoke first, describing her fear, describing the freeway, describing my obsessive documentation, describing the building complaint. He used words like pattern and escalation, and I listened without moving, because the best way to look stable is to behave stable when someone is trying to provoke you into looking unstable. When it was our turn, Dana spoke in the same simple language she had written for our response, and she anchored every point to an exhibit, because exhibits are how you starve drama. Then the judge asked Lila a direct question, the kind that makes liars uncomfortable. The judge asked if there had been any physical harm or direct threat of harm. Lila hesitated, because this was where her narrative had to become concrete, and concreteness was dangerous. She said no, but she said she felt emotionally unsafe. The judge asked for examples, and Lila spoke about the freeway again, about my cold stare, about my financial pressure, and the judge's face remained politely blank, because judges have seen every kind of attempted performance, and they don't clap. When Dana presented the ride cancellation confirmation and Lila's own text, the room shifted slightly, not into sympathy, but into clarity, because the freeway was no longer a moral argument. It was a documented cause and effect. Dana presented the building complaint email and noted that it did not identify any threats or violence and that it was consistent with a manufactured record rather than an actual emergency. Dana presented the bank deposit and pointed out that Lila's claim of fear had not prevented her from using shared funds for lodging. It wasn't about shaming her, it was about showing inconsistency, because inconsistency is how you puncture credibility. The judge asked Lila why she filed for protection if there was no specific threat, and Lila said she wanted boundaries. The judge said boundaries are handled through separation agreements, not through protection requests, and the judge's tone stayed neutral, but the meaning landed like a slap. Lila's lawyer tried to pivot, emphasizing emotional distress, emphasizing uncertainty, emphasizing safety, and the judge said plainly that the court could not grant exclusive use of a shared home on vague fear without supporting incidents. When the hearing ended, the judge denied the temporary protection request and directed us toward standard civil separation procedures, and the denial felt like oxygen. It didn't solve the marriage, it didn't heal the betrayal, but it did something that mattered just as much in the new world Lila had created. It officially rejected her attempt to brand me as a threat. Lila walked out quickly, jaw tight, eyes bright with anger, and I understood that she wasn't finished, because losing the court narrative meant she would try to win elsewhere. In the courthouse hallway, her sister finally looked at me, and her expression wasn't kind, but it wasn't contempt either. It was something like embarrassment, the kind that comes from realizing you were used as a prop. She said quietly that Lila had told them I was dangerous, and she said she didn't know what to believe anymore. I told her she didn't have to choose a belief. She could choose facts, and I told her the facts were in the documents she had watched land in a judge's hands. She didn't answer, but she didn't argue either, and that was the closest thing to a concession I expected from her. My phone buzzed as I walked out of the building, and it was a message from Mara that arrived like a second thunderclap. She said HR had scheduled the final meeting for Ethan the next morning, and she said they had asked Lila to appear as well, because her name had now come up repeatedly in the investigation. Mara added one line that made my stomach tighten in that familiar way, because it meant the next day wasn't going to be quiet. Mara said HR intended to document everything, and she said the meeting would include a compliance facilitator who would read policy into the record. I stared at the message as the courthouse doors closed behind me, and I felt the shape of the next set piece form in my mind with cruel clarity, because Lila's world ran on witness perception and institutional leverage, and tomorrow she would be dragged into a room where perception was controlled by policy and minutes. She had tried to paint me as dangerous, and she had failed, but she still had one instinct left, the one she always reached for when she felt her control slipping. She would try to flip the story one last time in front of people who mattered, and if she did, She would do it with the same weapon she had always used, which was the confident lie delivered before anyone had time to check it. The only question now was whether she would realize too late that the room tomorrow was designed for documents, not performance, and I already knew I had exactly what she couldn't outtalk. The next morning, I met Mara outside the corporate building. She looked focused, resigned, no more denial. Ethan had begged her to handle me, but she was done protecting his lies. In the sterile conference room, HR, compliance, and a reluctant manager waited. Ethan arrived last, confidence fraying. Lila followed, composed, dressed for credibility. The facilitator read policy, then asked Ethan to explain his relationship with Lila. He downplayed it. One lapse, spontaneous, regretted, under stress. He claimed he contacted me only fearing for her safety, citing the freeway incident as proof of my instability. Lila added softly that I was cold, fixated on documentation, intimidating. She implied fear of escalation. I stayed factual, described the Uber confession, my exit, her stranded text. I presented ride cancellation proof and Ethan's screenshot urging story coordination. HR uncovered the hotel charge on the shared account. Lila claimed error but had no cancellation docs. Ethan's story shifted. He stumbled under questions about coordination and blame shifting. HR noted violations, affair with coworker, narrative tampering, undermining credibility. They announced Ethan's termination pending review. Lila received formal discipline, noted interference, blocked advancement. As we left, Lila hissed that I ruined her life. I replied calmly, she ruined it in the Uber. The rest was just consequences arriving. Mara warned Lila, any further contact and screenshots go everywhere. Outside, the truth didn't shout. It documented. Ethan lost his job, Lila her control. The liar's narratives collapsed under minutes and evidence.